The discovery. Dr. Calvan touched the crystalline surface with one of his 6 delicate fingers. The ancient database hummed beneath his touch, reluctant to give up its secrets. Around him, the dig site stretched across the barren moon, towers of metal and stone that had stood for millennia, forgotten by the galaxy. "Anything?" asked his assistant, a young Threshan whose scales shimmered nervously in the artificial light. "Not yet," Calvan replied. "These human archives are protected by encryption we've never seen before. It's been 300 years since they vanished, and we still can't crack their simplest locks." The Galactic Historical Society had funded this expedition with reluctance. Most species considered humanity a cautionary tale, a species that had risen fast, burned bright, and disappeared without explanation. They left behind ruins on 100 worlds, but no bodies, no final messages, no clues about where they went or why. Just silence. Calvan had spent his entire career studying human artifacts. While other scholars dismissed humanity as another failed civilization, he saw something different. The humans had built things that lasted. Their technology, though ancient by galactic standards, still functioned after centuries of neglect. Their cities, though empty, showed no signs of war or plague. They had simply left. "Doctor, you should see this," called Mira, his security chief. She was a Korthan, a species that valued strength above all else. Her 4 arms held weapons aimed at something in the shadows of a collapsed building. Calvan hurried over, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "What is it?" "Movement," Mira said. "Something's alive down there." That was impossible. This moon had been abandoned for 3 centuries. The atmosphere was thin, the temperature far below freezing. Nothing could survive here without life support. Then Calvan saw it, a faint blue glow pulsing from the ruins. Not the steady light of a machine, but something rhythmic, almost like breathing. "Prepare for contact," he ordered, though his heart raced with excitement rather than fear. This could be the discovery of a lifetime. The Guardian awakens. They descended into the ruins carefully, following the blue light through corridors that still bore human writing on the walls. Calvan recognized some of the symbols, warnings, directions, designations. The humans had been thorough in their record-keeping. The light led them to a massive circular chamber. At its center stood a pillar of crystalline material that reached from floor to ceiling. Inside the pillar, suspended in some kind of stasis field, was a human. Calvan's breath caught. In 300 years of searching, no one had ever found a human body. Some scholars believed they had transcended physical form. Others thought they had fled to another galaxy. But here was proof that at least one had stayed behind. The human was female, her dark hair floating around her face as if she were underwater. Her eyes were closed, her expression peaceful. She wore a simple uniform with symbols Calvan didn't recognize. "Is she alive?" whispered his assistant. Before Calvan could answer, the human's eyes opened. They were brown, warm, and completely aware. The blue light intensified, and the stasis field began to dissolve. Mira raised her weapons. "Everyone back." But Calvan stood his ground. "Wait. If she wanted to harm us, we'd already be dead. Look at this facility, it's been maintaining itself for 3 centuries. That takes incredible technology and purpose." The stasis field disappeared completely. The human woman drew a deep breath and stepped down from the pillar. She looked at each of them in turn, her gaze intelligent and assessing. Then she spoke. Her voice was rough from disuse, but the translation device on Calvan's collar rendered it perfectly. "You came. I wasn't sure anyone would. The last memory keeper." Her name was Sarah Chen, and she called herself a memory keeper. They sat in what had once been a human cafeteria while she drank water and explained her purpose. "When humanity decided to leave," Sarah said, "we knew we couldn't take everything with us. Our history, our culture, our knowledge, it represented thousands of years of learning. We couldn't let it vanish." "Leave?" Calvan leaned forward. "Where did humanity go?" Sarah smiled sadly. Somewhere you can't follow. Not yet, anyway. We discovered something about the nature of consciousness, about the relationship between thought and reality. It opened doors we couldn't resist walking through. But you stayed, Calvan said. Someone had to, Sarah replied. The memory keepers volunteered to remain behind, to wait for the galaxy to become ready for what humanity had learned. We placed ourselves in stasis, programmed to awaken when someone showed genuine curiosity about our culture rather than just scavenging our technology. Mira growled from her position by the door. You've been asleep for 300 years waiting for tourists? Not tourists, Sarah corrected gently. Teachers. People who could help other species understand what we learned, so they don't make the same mistakes we almost made. She stood and gestured for them to follow. Come. Let me show you why I've been waiting. The Library of Humanity. Sarah led them deeper into the facility, through halls that lit up at her approach and systems that activated at her touch. Calvan realized the entire complex was responding to her presence, recognizing her as its master. They entered a chamber so vast it took Calvan's breath away. Towers of data storage stretched in every direction, reaching up into darkness. Holographic displays floated everywhere, showing images of human history, art, science, music, war, peace, triumph, and tragedy. This is the archive of humanity, Sarah said. Every book we ever wrote. Every song we ever sang. Every discovery, every mistake, every lesson learned across 10,000 years of civilization. We left copies scattered across 100 worlds, waiting for species like yours to find them. Why? Asked Calvan. Why share this freely? Most species guard their knowledge jealously. Sarah turned to face him, and in her eyes, he saw something that made his heart ache, loneliness mixed with hope. Because knowledge hoarded is knowledge wasted, she said. Humanity learned that the hard way. We spent centuries fighting over resources, over territory, over ideas. We nearly destroyed ourselves a dozen times. But we always survived because of one thing, our ability to learn from our mistakes and share what we learned with others. She walked to a holographic display showing Earth in its prime, blue oceans, green continents, white clouds swirling in the atmosphere. We came from a death world, Sarah continued. High gravity, extreme weather, aggressive predators. We evolved as persistence hunters, chasing prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. That taught us patience and determination. But it also taught us cruelty and aggression. I've read the reports, Calvan said. Other species fear humans because of your capacity for violence. And they should, Sarah agreed. But they should also understand that our capacity for violence came from the same place as our capacity for compassion, curiosity, and cooperation. We were survivors who learned that survival was easier when we worked together. The test. Sarah activated a control panel, and the entire archive hummed to life. The galaxy is approaching a crisis, she said. In approximately 50 years, a threat will emerge that will test every civilization. The corruption, a force that feeds on conflict and fear, turning species against themselves. Mira stepped forward. How do you know this? Because humanity faced it 1,000 years ago, Sarah replied. We barely survived. But we learned how to fight it, how to resist it, how to help others resist it. That knowledge is here in the archive. She turned to Calvan. The question is the galaxy ready to receive it? Humanity's knowledge is powerful, but power without wisdom is dangerous. That's why memory keepers exist, to judge whether those who find us are ready. Calvan felt the weight of her gaze. And what do you judge of us? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying each member of his team. Then she smiled. You came looking for understanding, not just profit. You showed caution but not hostility. You asked questions instead of making demands. These are good signs. She extended her hand in the ancient human gesture of greeting. Dr. Calvan of the Galactic Historical Society, on behalf of humanity, I grant you access to our archives. Use them wisely. Teach others what we learned. Help the galaxy prepare for what's coming. Calvan took her hand, feeling the warmth of human skin for the first time. I will. I swear it. Good, Sarah said. Because you're going to need help. The corruption is already beginning to stir, and there are only 73 memory keepers scattered across the galaxy. We need to wake them all and prepare every species for the fight of their lives. Will you help us? Calvan asked. Sarah's smile widened. Doctor, I've been waiting 300 years for someone to ask me that question. Of course I'll help. It's what memory keepers were made for, to ensure that humanity's greatest lesson isn't forgotten. What lesson is that? That knowledge shared is power multiplied, Sarah replied. And that the strongest weapon in the universe isn't technology or firepower, it's cooperation between different minds working toward a common goal. As the archive continued to activate around them, revealing centuries of human wisdom, Calvan realized that his expedition had discovered something far more valuable than ancient artifacts. They had found humanity's true legacy, not weapons or ships, but the accumulated wisdom of a species that had learned to survive by helping others survive. The memory keeper was awake. And the galaxy was about to learn what humanity had really left behind. First warning. 3 months after awakening Sarah Chen, Calvan stood before the Galactic Council. The chamber was filled with representatives from 47 species, all skeptical of his claims. They sat in their designated sections, separated by custom and history, united only by the loosest political bonds. The human claims there's a threat coming, said High Chancellor Vexmore, his mandibles clicking skeptically. Yet we've detected nothing unusual in our scans. That's because the corruption doesn't exist in normal space, Sarah said, stepping forward. Her presence caused murmurs throughout the chamber. Living humans were rare, almost mythical to most species. It exists in the space between thoughts, she continued. In the gaps where fear and mistrust grow. It feeds on conflict, amplifying disagreements into violence. By the time you can detect it physically, it's already too late. Convenient, said Ambassador Threll, a Korthian military leader. An invisible threat that conveniently requires us to trust humanity's word. Not just humanity's word, Calvan interjected. He activated a holographic display showing data from the human archives. I've spent 3 months studying their records. Humanity faced the corruption 1,000 years ago. It nearly destroyed them. But they survived and documented everything. The hologram showed images of Earth during what humans called the Dark Decades, cities burning, populations turning against each other, civilizations collapsing into chaos. But it also showed the recovery, the techniques humanity had developed to resist the corruption's influence. The pattern is always the same, Sarah explained. The corruption arrives subtly, finding the cracks in a civilization. Old grievances resurface. Minor disagreements become major conflicts. Species that once cooperated begin to suspect and fear each other. Like what's happening now, whispered Mira from her position behind Calvan. She was right. Over the past 3 months, tensions across the galaxy had increased dramatically. Trade disputes had become heated confrontations. Diplomatic missions had been cancelled. Ancient enemies were remembering old wars. It's already begun, Sarah said quietly. The corruption is here. The divide. The council dissolved into chaos. Representatives shouted accusations at each other. The Korthan delegation blamed the Threscians for recent border incidents. The Crystalline Collective accused the Nomad fleets of espionage. Species that had maintained peace for centuries suddenly found reasons to distrust each other. You see? Sarah said to Calvan over the noise. This is how it starts. The corruption amplifies existing tensions, making rational cooperation impossible. How do we fight something we can't see? Calvan asked. By doing exactly what the corruption doesn't want, Sarah replied. We cooperate. We trust. We share knowledge freely. The corruption feeds on division, so we respond with unity. But unity seemed impossible. The council meeting ended with nothing resolved and several delegations threatening to withdraw from galactic politics entirely. That night, in his temporary quarters, Calvan received a priority message from his home world. His own government was reconsidering its support for his research. The funds were being diverted to military expansion, just in case the brewing conflicts turned violent. "It's happening everywhere," Sarah said when he told her. "The corruption works fast once it gains a foothold. We need to wake the other memory keepers immediately. The network awakens." Sarah had coordinates for 72 other memory keeper sites scattered across the galaxy. Each one contained a human in stasis and a copy of humanity's archives. Together, they represented humanity's insurance policy, enough knowledge and enough teachers to help the galaxy survive what was coming. But traveling to each site would take years, and they didn't have years. The corruption was accelerating its influence, pushing the galaxy toward open warfare. "There's another way," Sarah said. She led Calvan back to the archive's central chamber and activated a control panel he had never seen before. "Before we left, humanity built something, a network that connects all the memory keeper sites. We can use it to wake everyone simultaneously." "Why didn't you mention this before?" Calvan asked. "Because it requires enormous power," Sarah replied. "Power that will light up every sensor in the galaxy. Once we activate this network, everyone will know exactly where all the memory keepers are located. Some species might see that as a threat." "And if we don't activate it?" Sarah met his eyes. "Then the corruption wins, and the galaxy tears itself apart. The choice is simple, even if the consequences aren't." Calvan thought of his home world, of the growing paranoia and fear. He thought of the council chamber dissolving into accusations. He thought of Sarah, who had waited 3 centuries to help species she had never met. "Do it," he said. Sarah's fingers flew across the control panel. The archive hummed with building energy. Then, with a pulse that Calvan felt in his bones, the network activated. Across the galaxy, on 72 different worlds, ancient human facilities came to life. Stasis fields dissolved. Memory keepers opened their eyes and began their mission. The teaching begins. The response was immediate and chaotic. Some species welcomed the memory keepers with curiosity. Others responded with suspicion or outright hostility. But the memory keepers were patient, just as Sarah was patient. They didn't force their knowledge on anyone. Instead, they offered it freely to those who asked. They showed species how humanity had recognized the corruption's influence, the subtle shifts in thinking that turned disagreement into hatred, the amplification of fear that made cooperation impossible. Most importantly, they taught resistance techniques. Meditation practices that strengthened mental discipline. Communication protocols that prevented misunderstandings from escalating. Cooperation exercises that built trust between different species. Calvan watched as Sarah worked with a Corthan military unit, teaching them techniques for recognizing when their aggressive instincts were being artificially amplified. The Corthans were skeptical at first, they prided themselves on their warrior culture. But Sarah showed them that true strength came from choosing when to fight, not from fighting because an invisible force pushed you toward violence. "Your species evolved as predators," Sarah told them. "So did mine. We understand the value of strength. But we also learned that the strongest warrior is the one who can recognize when they're being manipulated." Slowly, reluctantly, they began to listen. The corruption strikes back. But the corruption didn't accept defeat quietly. As more species learned resistance techniques, the invisible force changed tactics. If it couldn't turn species against each other, it would turn them against the memory keepers themselves. Rumors spread, humans had never really left, they had been waiting to conquer the galaxy. The memory keepers were agents of invasion, softening up civilizations for the main assault. The archives contained viruses that would corrupt alien minds. None of it was true, but truth didn't matter to those already infected by fear and suspicion. The attacks began on distant worlds. Memory keeper facilities were bombed. Some memory keepers were captured or killed. The galaxy was dividing into those who trusted humanity's legacy and those who saw it as a threat. "This is what happened to us," Sarah said sadly as she watched the reports. "The corruption turned humanity against itself before we learned to recognize what was happening. Families fought each other. Cities destroyed themselves. We lost billions before we understood the enemy." "How did you survive?" Calvan asked. "We remembered who we were," Sarah replied. "We looked past the fear and anger to the truth underneath. We were all human, all from the same world, all wanting the same basic things. Safety, purpose, connection. Once we remembered that, the corruption lost its power over us." "But the galaxy isn't one species," Calvan pointed out. "We're dozens of different civilizations with different values and histories." "That's actually an advantage," Sarah said. "Humanity almost fell because we were too similar. We thought alike, feared the same things, responded to manipulation in predictable ways. But the galaxy? You're diverse. You think differently, value different things, resist in different ways. The corruption will struggle to find tactics that work on all of you." The turning point. The crisis came on Velshar, a heavily populated world on the border between two rival empires. The corruption had been working there for months, turning neighbors into enemies, friends into suspects. The planet was hours away from civil war. 3 memory keepers worked on Velshar: Samuel, Maria, and Jackson. When the violence finally erupted, they didn't flee. Instead, they walked into the streets unarmed and began doing something simple: they started talking to people. Not preaching or teaching. Just talking. Asking questions. Listening to fears and concerns. Helping people remember their neighbors were still their neighbors, regardless of what the whispers in their minds told them. It should have failed. 3 humans against an entire planet gripped by the corruption's influence. But something unexpected happened. People began to listen. Maybe it was because the memory keepers were willing to stand in the middle of violence without weapons. Maybe it was because they offered understanding instead of judgment. Or maybe it was simply because, deep down, people wanted a reason to hope. Whatever the cause, the violence on Velshar began to decrease. Not quickly or easily, but gradually, as more people chose to question their sudden hatred of their neighbors. News of Velshar spread across the galaxy. Other worlds began reaching out to their local memory keepers, asking for help before the violence started rather than after. The Great Cooperation. 6 months after Sarachin woke from stasis, something unprecedented happened in galactic history. The council reconvened, but this time they didn't sit separated by species. Instead, following a human tradition Sarah had taught them, they formed mixed groups, different species sitting together, sharing perspectives, building understanding. "The corruption feeds on division," High Chancellor Vexmore said, his mandibles no longer clicking with hostility. "So we respond with cooperation. Not because it's easy, but because it's necessary." The vote was unanimous. The Galactic Defense Initiative was formed, not a military force, but an organization dedicated to teaching resistance techniques, building cross-species cooperation, and spreading the knowledge humanity had left behind. 73 memory keepers worked with thousands of volunteers from dozens of species. Together, they traveled the galaxy, teaching, listening, and helping civilizations recognize when they were being manipulated by invisible forces. The corruption didn't vanish. It was patient, ancient, and endlessly adaptive. But for the first time in recorded history, the galaxy was fighting back in unison. The legacy lives. 1 year after her awakening, Sarah stood with Calvan on the observation deck of the first joint human-alien research station. Below them, scientists from a dozen species worked side by side, studying the corruption and developing new resistance techniques. "Do you think we'll win?" Calvan asked. "I think we'll survive," Sarah replied. "That's what humanity learned: survival isn't about defeating every threat. It's about learning, adapting, and helping others do the same." "Your species really did leave us something valuable," Calvan said. "Not technology or weapons, but wisdom. Sarah smiled. That was always the plan. Humanity learned the hard way that the greatest legacy isn't what you build, but what you teach. Knowledge, shared freely and used wisely, multiplies with each generation. Will humanity ever come back? Calvan asked. Maybe, Sarah said. But by the time they do, the galaxy won't need them to. You'll have learned everything we could teach and added your own discoveries to the archive. That's the real gift, not our knowledge, but the framework for sharing knowledge across species and generations. As they watched scientists from different worlds collaborate on solving problems that would have seemed impossible a year ago, Calvan understood what humanity had really left behind. Not a warning. Not a weapon. But hope, and the tools to build a better future together. The memory keepers would continue their work. The corruption would continue its attempts at domination. But the galaxy had learned humanity's greatest lesson, that cooperation beats division, that wisdom shared is wisdom multiplied, and that the future belongs to those who refuse to fight alone.